How long, how long are we going to go for?
Oh, an hour. So would that be all right to you?
Yeah, but we'll have to keep strictly to an hour because I'm overburdened with work right now.
Okay. So I think we can finish maybe 5 or 10 minutes before. Okay. So proper intro now. It is a great honor to welcome Professor Norman G. Finkelstein to this program. He is a political scientist, and he recently published a collection of essay titled "I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It: Heretical Thoughts on Identity Politics, Cancel Culture, and Academic Freedom." How are you today, Norman? Thank you for joining the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let us begin with the epigraph of the book. It is a quote that says, "I feel a real and solid pleasure when anybody points out a fallacy in any of my views, because I care much less about my opinions than about their being true." The quotation is attributed to one Bertrand Russell. So why don't you tell us about how and why you included that quotation and how Bertrand Russell had an influence on you intellectually?
First of all, I would have to say that epigraph is aspirational, which is to say, I want and I try hard, fighting my ego and fighting assaults on my self-esteem to aspire to that attitude. Namely, it's about truth. It's not about me. And I have to, which I do, I have no problem accepting my fallibility. That to me has never been a challenge. My natural endowments, I think, are quite modest. What I've achieved through hard work. Nonetheless, like everybody, I have an ego, and when I'm found to be wrong on either minor points or at certain points in my life, global facts, um, then I resist, but also there's another voice in me, the so to speak, Bertrand Russell's super ego, which says, Norm, either you are or you aren't about truth. And if you're wrong, face up to it, make the course correction, and then pursue your purpose in life. I can't say Bertrand Russell had a big influence on me intellectually because most of his seminal contributions come in disciplines of which I'm wholly ignorant. However, I would say that I derived great pleasure from reading his autobiography. It was a genuinely exquisite literary experience. And I was always attentive to his observations, which is to say, some of his observations coming from somebody else, I might have taken with a grain of salt. But coming from him, I have to pause and think twice and three times and wonder, well, maybe he has a point there.
Mhm. I think in reference to the subtitle of your book, so the themes of cancel culture, identity politics, and academic freedom plays a great part in that one incident that made your name, well, the name, famous, so to speak, and that being your academic battles with one Alan Dershowitz from Harvard Law School. And without delving too much into the details of your skirmishes, how do you reflect on the series of events now?
I'm going to be candid with you, and people will probably treat these remarks with skepticism. They never played a very big part in my life.
Hmm.
You know, uh, Alan Dershowitz was I would say it was a strange accident. He never played a big part in my life intellectually. Um, and even in the Israel-Palestine conflict, the things he had to say were so egregiously false, so transparently false, so ridiculously false, that it wasn't even much. In fact, it wasn't any intellectual challenge to refute him. Now, in other of my undertakings, whether it was that book that sort of made my name a long time ago when I was in graduate school, namely parsing Joan Peters's From Time Immemorial, or when it was taking on the challenge of, at the time, the Harvard wunderkind Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, or when it was crossing swords with the leading Israeli historian Benny Morris, or when it was debating Israel's foreign minister Shlomo Ben-Ami. Those pose kinds of intellectual challenges or forensic challenges, trying to figure out how was this fraud contrived, trying to, as it were, unpack it. But Dershowitz was just a very silly, comical figure. And just by happenstance, his book, The Case for Israel, came out. I read it and I laughed at it because the first part of it was clearly plagiarized from a hoax, the hoax that I myself had exposed. So it was funny. But then I was exhorted to take apart the whole book because it was having a large influence in the public arena, in the public square. The book, The Case for Israel, was a national bestseller. And I then sat down to, what's the word, deconstruct it, as they say. And then when I was on the public affairs program with him and did as I normally do, I didn't really equip myself differently than I have at any other time prior to that occasion. I said to his face, the book is a complete hoax. It's completely ridiculous. You probably didn't read it. You probably didn't write it, and I doubt you even read it. But he took these remarks, which were not, frankly, uncommon coming from my mouth. He took these remarks very personally and then embarked on what Professor Chomsky called a jihad to stop me from getting tenure. And he played, I would say, a significant role, not just in stopping me from getting tenure, but because my case became so high profile, I was never able to work again at any job. So my professional life was terminated in June 2007 until around 2 years ago when I started to do adjunct teaching, which is basically a substitute teacher. Until around 2 years ago, I was wholly unemployed. And as I like to say, I wasn't just unemployed, I was unemployable. My name had been so besmirched and it had become so toxic to even mention my name that I was unable ever again to get gainful employment. And now it's over. You know, I'm 70 years old, and that that period in my life is over.
Yeah. So I had also had the opportunity of reading one of Dershowitz's other books in regards to the topic of the case against Israel's enemies. And of course, he named you as well as Professor Chomsky as one of them, the two of them, and also the other being Jimmy Carter, which I think is very surprising considering that, who was the one who helped the Jewish state gain his first peace with an Arab nation. And I reflect on that, and even though I may find Professor Dershowitz's side regarding the Israel-Palestine issue to be quite agreeable, it is incumbent upon me that a lot of American Jews, especially very prominent ones, it's very, I would say, tribal when it comes to the topic of Israel. And for that, I think people like yourself are heavily vilified. And of course, that is a very controversial opinion of mine. And I'm sure you have voiced such controversial opinions. And of course, nobody can accuse you of being a tribalist when it comes to this issue. So
I think it was true for a very long time, but things have dramatically changed. Israel is a ultra-right state. It's a lunatic state. It's the belongs to that same category as Bolsonaro in Brazil, Modi in India. These really creepy far-right regimes. And American Jews tend to be politically in the moderate to liberal end of the spectrum. And so it became at a certain point untenable for American Jews to be faithful to their overwhelmingly Democratic Party, woke, enlightened values on the one hand, and to blindly defend Israel on the other. And so, especially in what you would probably the under 40 generation, there has been a distancing from Israel, which comes pretty close to an estrangement at this point. And Israel is a kind of an embarrassment, which American Jews would, if they had the option, prefer to forget.
Yes, and I think a lot of Israelis would agree to you as they
I don't think that's true. That's just a myth. There's a small handful of liberals in Tel Aviv, what you would call, not I'm particularly fond of the language, but I'll just use it for this moment, what one might call liberal Zionists in Tel Aviv, who at least like to who prefer at least the veneer of being liberal and enlightened, and also worry themselves about Israel moving so far to the right that their secular values and secular lifestyle is being put in jeopardy. But even those small enclaves in Tel Aviv, they're quite tiny, insignificant. Even those small enclaves, they have never been particularly sensitive to Palestinian rights or willing to go the distance to fight for Palestinian rights. So I think it's a myth foisted on the West that there is this kind of civil war brewing in Israel. Israel is a far-right country, and we're not just referring to the state, we're referring to the population. It's a ultra-right country, and the overwhelming majority of the people support the policies represented by Netanyahu, who's already the far right, and then everybody to the right of him. Because he's, by a normal spectrum, he's far right. By the Israeli spectrum, he's moderate.
Yeah, so I think ever since one of your early works, which is titled The Holocaust Industry, which is already a pretty provocative title, let alone its contents, I think you've always been vocal about the issue of the rights of the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank and the like. And I wonder, I should like to add that the May-June issue of Foreign Affairs, in that one article, they had an article titled "Israel's is one state reality?" And I think reading that article made me kind of despair for the possibility of that two-state solution. So I guess my question now to you is, I wonder if there is also a moral dimension into your, I guess, intellectual work in regards to the conflict brewing in this region.
You can't pull solutions out of a textbook and impose them on reality. That's not politics. Politics is examining the balance of political forces at any given moment, as well as in the foreseeable future, against what you consider a desirable outcome or a desirable goal. And so, what is the desirable outcome or goal in Israel is a separate issue from what is realistically possible in any event to mitigate the suffering of Palestinians. What is realistically possible now and in the foreseeable future. I was never wedded to two states. I wasn't wedded to one state. I remain what I was as a young man. I am still a communist with a small c, and I believe in a world without states. I don't think any sensible person living at this point in time can possibly believe otherwise. It's completely irrational. All of the problems confronting humanity right now, be it climate change, be it the very real prospect of nuclear conflagration instigated by the United States, or be it a global economic system which, notwithstanding real pockets of progress, like China, a global economic system that has become totally dysfunctional for the overwhelming mass of humankind. If you take those three issues, the dysfunction of the global capitalist system with pockets of prosperity like China, or prospects of pockets of progress, climate change, nuclear conflagration, these are all global problems. They cannot be solved at the level of a state. So any rational person, a moment's reflection, would say that a world without states is not just a "we are the world" Michael Jackson wish. It's the only rational way to confront the problems facing humanity. However, as I said earlier, you can't pluck from a textbook solutions. You have to deal with the balance of existing political forces to see what's possible in the present and near future. In the case of Israel-Palestine, I think it is true to say that the two-state solution is probably not realizable anymore because there are no political forces on the global arena supporting it. Nobody much cares about the Palestinians anymore. They have ceased to be a major factor or even a minimal factor in international politics. So there are no global forces leaning in direction of two states. And by the time the Palestine movement resurrects itself, the reality will be one state. Israel is clearly determined to annex. Well, Israel has already annexed the West Bank and Gaza. De facto, they're part of Israel. There's no separate Palestinian reality. It's one state in which roughly half the population has no rights. It's an apartheid state. Well, probably it's worse than apartheid, but because there were more rights under apartheid than there are for Palestinians in Israel. They have no right to vote and all the rights that flow from the right to vote. They have no rights of citizenship and all the rights that flow from the right of citizenship. Are you in the US or the UK? Can't remember.
Oh, I'm in Europe, Vienna, Austria.
Okay. So in the United States, we have what's called the 14th Amendment to our Constitution. And our 14th Amendment establishes two things simultaneously. Number one, anyone born in the United States is a citizen of the country. And number two, everybody is guaranteed equal protection under the law. Why do I mention that? Because it was understood that citizenship and equality before the law, they go together. In the case of Israel, there's one state. It includes the state of the original state of Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, which have been annexed to Israel. There is one state in which the Palestinian Arab population overwhelmingly has no rights of citizenship. And as our 14th Amendment points up, if you have no rights of citizenship, you have no rights before the law. And so it's an apartheid state. I think that's pretty clear.
I think, a slight pushback would be, well, the U.S. Constitution does not apply to Israel, and
well, that's not. It's not a question of the U.S. Constitution applying to Israel. It's a question as to how democratic states conceive the relationship between citizenship and basic democratic rights, namely equality before the law. And if you don't have one, you don't have the other. And in Israel, they don't have, Palestinians have no right, no citizenship, and therefore they have no rights.
Okay. So I hope we can migrate away from the Israel-Palestine problem, because your collection of essay has plenty of great, interesting, provocative insights in it. And one of it being that you are a great supporter of Bernie Sanders and also a great critic of what you call wokeness. And I think in the podcast episode that I listened to where you did with Glenn Lowry, you referred to wokeness as a triple scam. And so I wonder if you can relate that idea to us now.
Well, wokeness, when I wrote the book, I looked at it as a topic of ridicule, as a comedic aspect of left politics. But I also looked at it as having played and continued to play a very destructive role in trying to create a mass popular movement based on what's always been a hallmark of leftist politics, based on a class platform that will redistribute wealth and therefore create new opportunities, life opportunities, for the overwhelming mass of the American people. About 80%, 20% are doing just fine, and then better than fine. But since writing the book, and I know it's not so long ago, but since writing the book, I have come to the conclusion that wokeness is a kind of gangrene. It's a really pernicious phenomenon that's very right wing. Its its icons include these Nazi theorists like Carl Schmitt. It is ferocious in its prosecution of the insane war in Ukraine. It is ferocious in its opposition to any class-based or radical politics, whether it was Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020, or it's RFK Jr. and Cornel West right now. The sheer venom and viciousness of these woke icons is really a sight to behold. So now at this point, I would go one step further in than I did in the book. I wouldn't call it just, not that it's just, it was significant, but not just a destructive force passing itself off as leftist politics or progressive politics or enlightened politics. It's a gangrene. It's a really insidious phenomenon, totally sick, in my opinion. Really, it's a sick phenomenon. And I think energy, alas, needs to be invested in exposing it and confronting it for what it is. It's a right-wing movement. It's not left-wing at all.
There's a certain like snake oil quality to woke leftism, and one of the things I find very funny is how people who are committed to so-called woke ideologies, they would tout Angela Davis around as if she's one of them. And if you're familiar with the intellectual as well as the political history of Angela Davis, she's like a really genuine radical, right?
She was. She isn't anymore.
Mm-hmm.
She's completely and totally woke. And she lets herself be used. Angela Davis is not a babe in the woods. She has a rich political history, most of which I don't agree with, but I give credit where credit's due. She's very smart. She studied at the Sorbonne. She studied with Adorno at the Free University in West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany. She was 22 and already teaching Kant in the UCLA philosophy department.
Mm-hmm.
She's impressive. And she showed a lot of raw physical courage in her early life. But now Angela is all about pronouns. She's all about gender non-binary, this and that. She has her own radical fashion line. She charges $30,000 plus solidarity lectures. She's not what she was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess to use the language fashionable in the 60s and 70s, she totally sold out, man.
Yeah, she did totally sell out, but she did it in a kind of non-aware way. It wasn't like most people who sell out are pretty calculating. And they know exactly what they're doing. They know, as the expression has it, who's buttering their bread, what side of the bread is being buttered. They know he who pays the piper calls the tune. They know exactly what's going on. Angela, she sort of unconsciously was like sleepwalking into wokeness. So I I don't I wouldn't say I wouldn't say her she's sold out. I would say she ended up sold out. It was not quite the calculated process that you can observe in other people. I don't think so. I don't think there was calculation there. That's my impression. But I only met her once, and I don't know much about her.
So, but you've expressed a great deal of admiration towards Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, and the way I see it, even if I disagree very much with him, I still see him as a genuine figure of the political left, and as in contrast
No,
to
I wouldn't say that anymore.
Oh, okay.
I
That's
wish I could say that.
Mhm.
And I'm not one of those people who's going to say, "Oh, Bernie was always a fraud and a fake, and he tricked people." I don't believe that. I mean, Bernie, he ran a campaign that had two aspects to it. It was a Democratic primary, and he was running for the presidential office. And he also promised what he called our revolution, which was supposed to be a transformational movement to achieve systemic change in our country. What happened was when the Democratic primary fizzled out, or I should say, when he lost the Democratic primary, he basically abandoned our revolution, and he decided instead to be a surrogate for the left inside the White House. He would have he would have President Biden, so to speak, left ear. He would say, "No, Joe, we really need to do this for working people. We need to do that for people who need medical coverage." And he thought by whispering in Biden's ear, he can extract something for the left. That's not radical politics, and it's not going to achieve very much. Radical politics is about mobilizing, organizing, educating, galvanizing masses of people to try to affect social change. He completely abandoned that because he realized if I pursue that course, Biden is going to throw me out. Biden doesn't like the idea of masses of people in the street making demands and then committing civil disobedience and expressing a willingness to go to jail. That's not Biden's style of politics. He's a Democratic Party hack. So Bernie knew he had to make a choice, and his choice was to ditch the revolution. And in certain respects, he's been completely awful. On the question of Ukraine, I think what he's done is criminal. And I don't recoil from saying that. His unequivocal embrace of Biden's murderous war in the Ukraine is criminal. A war that could prove to be, nobody will be around to claim foresight, it could prove to be terminal for humanity. The people in the White House, Jake Sullivan, Victoria Nuland, Anthony Blinken, they're complete maniacs. No, they are. That's not a joke, and it's not an epithet that's being hurled capriciously. It's a terrifying fact. These people are maniacs as they're engaged in the war in Ukraine, which could quite easily spin out of control, and certifiable Nazis having weapons in their hands that can target Russian nuclear reactors. It's all bets are off on where this is going. And on top of that, these certifiable maniacs are now planning for a war with China because they don't want to let go of their global dominance. They don't accept that their day in the sun is coming to an end. They will not leave center stage willingly. They rather blow up the whole theater. These are maniacs. And Bernie Sanders has lent his moral weight to them. And in my opinion, that's criminal.
I think one can say that, well, there is a line that's being blurred, right, between the US aiding Ukraine to protect its borders against Russian forces and the US engaging in war with Russia, with Ukraine as the proxy.
The US is not aiding Ukraine. This is all a complete and total fabrication of the US ruling class and its media lickspittles. What did the US do for Ukraine? We saw it in Vilnius this past week. The mask was taken off. You know what happened? Here's what happened. The US set Ukraine up by arming it to the teeth with weapons, with NATO exercises in which it jointly participated, in training NATO's armed forces. It armed Ukraine to the teeth to provoke Russia. And when Russia saw no other option except to accept the provocation, what did the US tell NATO? What did the US tell Ukraine? You know what it told them? You're not joining NATO. You know why the US said you're not joining NATO? Because of Article 5. Article 5 says, of the NATO treaty says, if you belong to NATO and you're attacked by a foreign power, all the NATO powers have to join in to defend you. But that would mean the US would be at war with Russia. But that wasn't the plan. The plan was Ukraine would be the sacrificial lamb, get into a war with Russia, bleed Russia, or bleed Russia's armed forces, while Ukraine was devastated and destroyed, and the US stands by the side and then picks up all the pieces when Ukraine is destroyed and Russia is bled. That's helping Ukraine. That's helping Ukraine. And that complete buffoon, that comic figure created by the West, Zelensky, suddenly his eyes were opened. He said this past week, this is absurd. Why aren't you letting us into NATO? We just lost maybe 300,000 of our young men. Our country has been destroyed, and you're not letting us in? And now the buffoon, it sunk in on the buffoon that he had been taken on a ride. He was never supposed to be in NATO, because if he was in NATO, Article 5 would be activated and they would have to fight for him or fight for Ukraine. But that wasn't part of the plan. The plan was let Ukraine be devastated by Russia, bleed Russia's army, let Ukraine be destroyed, and then we, NATO, the criminal maniacs in Washington will get to walk away with all the spoils of victory. That was the plan. And it became painfully obvious to that buffoon, Mr. Zelensky, this past week. And he said, I'm not going to NATO's summit in Vilnius. I won't go. And then they whispered in his ear, Mr. Zelensky, you don't bite the hand that feeds you. And then he showed up, Jens Quisling Stoltenberg patted the head of the little obedient boy, and they got all the photo ops so as to proclaim a successful NATO summit while Ukraine is turned into a parking lot, or more accurately, a colossal cemetery. That's helping Ukraine. That's a trap by the monsters and bastards in Washington. It's a trap. And he fell into it. And I'll be completely candid. I didn't figure it out. I didn't understand what was going on. By 2022, when the war began, NATO was supplying Ukraine with weapons. NATO was training Ukrainian troops. NATO was engaging in joint military exercises with Ukraine. I couldn't figure out, why won't they let Ukraine in NATO now? They kept saying, it takes time, you have to wait, maybe next year, tomorrow, or tomorrow, or tomorrow. Couldn't figure out what was going on. And then it dawned on me this week, with the Vilnius summit. Ukraine was never supposed to join NATO. Ukraine was supposed to die for NATO, not vice versa. NATO wasn't supposed to protect Ukraine from Russian aggression. Ukraine was supposed to die for NATO, not vice versa. It's so perfidious, so insidious. These monsters, these ghouls who run the world. That's what happened.
Well, those are some very provocative positions that you're taking. And well, if that is the case, then well, where is the Ukrainian anti-war movement, so to speak? There was one in Vietnam, right? When the U.S. was at war with Vietnam, not in Vietnam itself.
I think that the people who would have been the natural leaders, like Bernie Sanders. Look, Bernie Sanders was supposed to be a person of the left. People who should have been the natural leaders failed us. And strangely enough, if you opened up the New York Times today, it's the far right of the Republicans, the Republican far right, that's trying to block funding for the Ukraine war. Very strange thing that happened in our country.
Mm-hmm. Right. So that brings us to Cornel West and Robert Kennedy Jr., whom you find that they may be aspiring to be the natural leader figures. So I wonder, what do you see in them, respectively, Cornel and Robert?
A large part of the socialist tradition is using the periodic electoral cycle, to use the electoral cycle, in order to educate. I don't I'm not into great white saviors or black saviors. I'm not into white saviors or black messiahs. It's not my politics. I don't believe in it. As I said, I'm an old-fashioned person of the left. I believe in mobilizing people, galvanizing people, educating people. Nonetheless, their campaigns can be used as important platforms for enlightening and educating the American people. And I have to say, in recent weeks, this past week, Cornel West has been excellent. He put out a very harsh statement on what's going on in Ukraine. And it totally enraged the woke so-called left. One of the standard bearers of that woke world, his name is Keith Olbermann. Beneath Cornell's statement, he wrote, and I'm quoting him now, "Fuck off. Fuck off." They're so angry that Cornell has become an uppity nigger. He doesn't know his place. And they want to cut him down to size. So I think to the extent that people like Cornel West articulate and educate, articulate a progressive vision and educate people, it's a positive phenomenon. And then we have to wait and see how far it goes. Cornel has very good grassroots connections. He knows a lot of people. He's been a man about town for the last 30 years. And it's possible he will be able to tap into those connections and build a real grassroots movement around his presidential aspiration. And that would be a good thing. It's much too soon to tell. But for now, the fact that the woke left is telling him to fuck off, to me, is a very positive sign.
Yeah.
He's saying the right things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that statement. Yeah, I think Cornell is a profound intellectual, and I'm very interested.
I wouldn't say he's profound. He's very smart, very knowledgeable. He's not just a mile wide and an inch deep. He's a mile wide and he's quite deep. He knows a lot. And I just hope and pray he finds the right language to connect with working class white people. It's going to be tough, but I hope he can find the right language and that he can play a liberatory role in the coming year, coming 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I won't commit myself to him right now. I'm watching him closely, and I was very pleased at his statement on Ukraine this past week. It sounded the right notes, and he had a very good quote from the most famous Black intellectual of the 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois. It was good.
Right. So, final question. You've actually introduced me via your talk with Glenn Lowry to Paul Robeson, who you said is an intellectual hero of yours. So tell us about who he is and what you and I can learn from him.
Paul Robeson was a genuine Renaissance man. He was an unrivaled athlete in many sports: baseball, football, basketball, track. He knew, estimates vary, but somewhere along the lines of 15 languages. He was a Shakespearean actor. He was valedictorian, meaning he graduated first in his college class. And at some point in his life, in the 1930s, with the rise of fascism, he identified with the left. He identified with the pro-Soviet Union left. He made many mistakes, as did many people back then, but he held on hard to his integrity. And he, as he famously said, I will not retreat 1,000th part of 1 inch. That's when the Cold War broke out, and everybody had to take these anti-communist loyalty oaths, or your career would be destroyed. He said, let my career be destroyed, which it was. But he was an indefatigable fighter for African American rights. He was an indefatigable fighter for workers' rights all over the world, be it Welsh miners, Australian workers. He used to sing this song about a labor organizer named Joe Hill, who was framed on a murder charge and was killed. He was an anarchist. And one of the lines in the film, wherever workers, I dream, that's wherever workers, so something like, wherever workers fight for their rights, it's there you'll find Joe Hill. And guess what? Wherever workers were fighting for their rights, it's there you'll find Paul Robeson. He was, simply put, a magnificent human being, and his voice still resonates. Even if you strip him of all of his politics, and I wouldn't for a day, for a minute, strip him of his politics, but even if you did, the voice was unequaled.
On that wonderful note, thank you very much, Professor Norman Finkelstein, for joining the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.